My name's Woody Thompson. I'm with RS&H. I'm the region leader for commissioning and energy. I work between Jacksonville, Florida and San Antonio, Texas. And today I want to present a case on how is energy resiliency dependent upon commissioning. And it's very intentional that I put a question on that. 2-3 years ago, started hearing the first snippets of about microgrids and how can we do on a campus level or for DoD at a base level surety of bulk power systems. And it started making my wheels turn because, of course, in commissioning, whether it's traditional new construction commissioning or existing building commissioning, we do look at power generation, N+1 systems, redundant systems, things of that nature. But the wheels started turning. It was like, well, what about contingency operation, emergency action? And that was the first kernels of thought about this presentation that I developed and have had the privilege to present to you today. Before I get too much further, a little bit of background about myself. I've been in the industry 25 years. I started out in HVAC test and balance in San Antonio, and my first touches of commissioning was at Fort Hood. Did quite a lot of barracks in the early to mid 90s. And at that point, commissioning for the DoD wasn't as polished as it is today. And polished is debatable, we can talk about later. But it's definitely evolved over time on the federal level. And as the previous presentation had mentioned, commissioning is codified. It's part of the international codes. A lot of states and municipalities are requiring commissioning. So what used to be perceived generally as a nice to have, owners are starting to realize there's real value to this, where it's very mandatory in the public sector in most places, and the private sector is definitely coming along. So my background, again, is did test and balance for 11 years, and I said, hey, I want to go where the action is. So I went back to school and got my mechanical engineering degree and got on the design side, and the nightmares were still the same. I was just in a different type of office. But really enjoyed it, really enjoyed still being involved with commissioning and seeing it evolved, and energy and the relationship between the two processes, especially in existing building commissioning and energy. And that has all led to where I am today, sharing some interesting information about how this whole concept of commissioning is evolving, and it's grown beyond your traditional HVAC controls, lights, domestic hot water, where it's getting more holistic, the total building commissioning concept, and even beyond that, where you're looking at campuses, not just focused on facilities. Before I really get into it, this is an AIA course, your typical AIA slide for continuing education credit. And the course description, the need for energy resiliency at the facility level was illustrated by devastating hurricanes last year. Being from the great state of Texas, we understand that with Harvey, in Florida with Irma, and in Puerto Rico with Maria. But at the same time, while that was happening, and it didn't get as much coverage, unfortunately, 2 major earthquakes in Mexico with residual effects from that, and raging fires in the Pacific Northwest. So a lot of this attention, a lot of natural disaster type things that really paralyzed many, many facilities. So existing building commissioning is a method to determine facility energy resilience, and ensuring that facility systems maintain reliability is the ultimate focus and goal for successful existing building commissioning. I'm going to try and present in this presentation this morning about, okay, what is resilience? What is energy resilience? What's a little bit of history about that? And how is it applicable at the facility level? We talk a lot about, securing bulk power systems. I'm drilling down one more level to the facility level And what is that relationship? And hopefully when you walk out of here today, you'll get a better understanding of what I'm proposing. And so I'm going to look, again, present some commonalities between resiliency and commissioning. Understand all of this is really important on the CFR, current facility requirements. Understanding what those current facility requirements are, and when you're dealing with contingency operations, emergency action plans, disaster preparedness, whatever you want to call it, that current facility requirement needs to be understood in the planning phase, not after the storm or the attack has hit. I'm going to give you, like I mentioned, how federal laws evolved talking about resiliency, and then, illustrating the recent natural disasters that have made this topic so important for discussion and action. So, the threats are real. Threats are very real. And they don't forecast when they're going to come. Dealing with global terrorism, I think the biggest threat that's out there, more than overt actions, is the covert actions with making cybersecurity such an important thing. When you can sit in a room half a world away and paralyze power generation stations in our country, we have to pay attention to that. We have to have defense of that. And if we do have an attack that is somewhat successful or devastatingly successful, how quickly can we bounce back from that? What do we have in place to prepare our facilities for those attacks? We can never sit back in comfort knowing that these are never going to happen. They happen every single day, every single hour. I can't remember the statistics, but it was amazing. Just on the nation's power grid alone is attacked thousands of times per hour, every single day, around the clock, by belligerent forces, internal as well as external to our country. So the threats are very, very real, and they're known. It's how we prepare for them is the difference. And of course, as I said earlier, this is a Hurricane Harvey photo out of Houston. Hurricane Irma and its trajectory going in through Florida. And of course, what happened with Puerto Rico, which they're still recovering from. They're still having massive power outages in Puerto Rico. And this is over a year ago. So, what is energy resilience? From the very strict governmental definition from the Homeland Security, the term resilience refers to the ability to adapt to changing conditions, withstand and rapidly recover from disruptions. But what's important, it's how we react to acts of terrorism, cyber attacks, pandemics, and catastrophic natural disasters. So it's the whole gamut. And to boil it down and not to overly simplify, how quickly can we bounce back, whether it's a natural attack or not? And this is, in this definition, the part that I like the most is the last blurb. National preparedness is the shared responsibility of all levels of government, private, nonprofit sectors, in other words, all of us. All of us that are in the industry, whether we're a consultant, whether or not we're a contractor, or for many of us in this room, a commissioning provider, we all play a role in this resilience discussion. Whether or not it's been directly alluded to doesn't make a difference. How we do the quality of our work in design and construction and maintaining and testing all goes back to the resilience discussion. Very critical for our military installations, very critical for our hospitals, very critical for our laboratories. This is a very real discussion that we need to have more details. So the resiliency components, it's really broke down to three of them. A lot of talk on the utility side with electric, gas, water, et cetera. This is the microgrid discussion that comes into here. And then on the real security part of it, physical security, ComSec, communication security, as well as cyber. Cyber is in everything these days, and it's something that is just not for the government, not for federal, but it does all gamuts of all sectors. But what I want to focus on is on the facility level and all the components that make up the facility level that we are already doing in commissioning with HVAC, lighting, life safety, plumbing, power. So let's talk a little bit about where on the governmental side the most recent history. In 2010, there was a national security strategy that started talking about resilience for the first time and what do we really need to do, and the basic topics that came out of that was we need to be able to have a program in place to prepare, withstand, and rapidly recover from any kind of attack. And when I mean attack, I mean, is this earthquakes, fires, storms, whatever the attack is, how are we prepared? Again, the definition of disaster preparedness. In 2010, realized that there may be some shortfalls in the existing policies that we have. So in 2011, FEMA established the 5 national preparedness goals of prevent, protect, mitigate, respond, and recover, and wrote quite a detailed policy letter about how FEMA needed to achieve these sort of things that was very applicable across multiple agencies. And in the 2014 Quadrennial Homeland Security Review, really pushed the need of those 5 caveats to strengthen national preparedness and resilience. And the efforts have gone forward since then of what do we do? And the focus has been on the national power grid and how can we isolate certain sectors. So the resiliency standards started showing up in EBCx 2005, and then the real drivers were the next 2, the FERC and the NERC. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission had a lot of different orders in there, and the 2 most applicable to what I'm talking about today was 693 and the reliability standards and 706, which deals with the critical infrastructure protection, the CIPs. And there's multiple CIPs that go down to the facility level, but the facilities they're talking about are power generation. And looking at a lot of the things in Order 706, a light bulb went off in my head that, hey, some of this stuff, some of these CIPs are directly related to buildings. Now, not necessarily all buildings, but there's still some analogies there that we can apply through the prism of existing building commissioning. And of course, that also led into the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the NERC, which also has a lot of the numerous CIP standards that came from Order 706. So one was just the next evolution of the other. But again, the focus was on the reliability and security of the bulk power systems in North America. And that's appropriate. There's nothing wrong with that. But in my opinion, there's something missing. I don't think it's an oversimplification to present that, okay, fine, we're taking care of our bulk power systems, that's important, that's good, that's great. But if the facilities that are using this power are nowhere prepared in the first place, then what's the point? We're going to spend more time, more money, more resources trying to bounce back on the facility level to take advantage of a reliable power. So again, wheels turning, there's something missing about this. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about, why we, a little bit of, not why we do commissioning, but what's the whole point of commissioning, existing building commissioning. Most of you in this room are probably well aware of the things I'm going to be presenting now. But I do this to illustrate a point that I'm building a bridge here between 2 concepts. the construction and renovation goals for anyone that's involved is we want high-performing, functional buildings that are sustainable, that are easy to maintain, efficient, healthy, and if we do these, we do these facilities properly on the design side, on an O&M side, on a construction side, on a commissioning side. It's great for reputations. We have pride in what we do, and that is the goal in our buildings. It enhances everyone's reputation on successful projects, and that's what we're all striving for. So, basic definition out of ASHRAE of traditional commissioning. The two things, and all of you in this room are very familiar with this, but the two things I want to bring out is always what we do is focused on quality, enhancing quality. We're a value-added service. We're a value-critical service, in my opinion. And the things that we do is to make owners feel confident in the facilities that they are paying for work, that they can live and function and maintain. And we do it to their standards, not to our standards, not to the designer standards or the contractor standards or Woody Thompson standards. Oops, sorry. To my standards. But it's to the owner's standards. So he has confidence that in the work and the services that we're providing are legitimate, that they did bring quality. So, what's the point here? Well, a lot of when we talk about the energy side of the equation, we want to make sure, how do we maintain under all conditions, not just ideal conditions, the function of that facility? And there is a real possibility that a natural disaster will hit, a cyber attack will hit. And what are we doing now for when it happens tomorrow, next month, or 10 years from now? In existing building commissioning, are we thinking about that? This slide that I got up here is there's a lot of unique nomenclature in what we do, a lot of acronyms. In existing building commissioning is the overall umbrella, and the retro and the recommissioning. Not necessarily with this group, but in other groups, some people don't understand what's this retro and recommissioning and all this that you're talking about. So I like to present this slide just to kind of make sure everybody understands what we're talking about here when we're dealing with the commissioning of process as applied to an existing facility. It's the retro commissioning is where a facility was never commissioned in the first place for whatever reason. And of course, the recommissioning is to commission those facilities and systems that had at one time and needed to be reassessed because, well, show of hands, how many facilities never change from the moment of first construction and you turn over the keys to the building? None? Really? Wow. So again, fine-tuning facilities is critically important. And there is tons and tons and tons of references and guidance and standards. I deal primarily more on the public sector, federal than private sector in all candor. So a lot of my focus is in the what they call the Sustainability UFC 1-200-02. But again, with Standard 202 we're all familiar with, and the various different references that allude to commissioning, and of course the guiding principles, very, very important. One of the first caveats of the guiding principles is thou shalt do commissioning. So, this is a very legitimate process. It's very real. It's a requirement. It's been codified in the international codes, and you're seeing a lot of traction on the private sector more than ever before, in my opinion. And there's tons and tons and tons of information to help educate owners and to have our service improve. So, why existing building commissioning? It's 5 phases. It's a process to apply to a building that was either never commissioned in the first place, or the mission or the function of that facility has changed. But what I'm going to start getting into about connecting the dots here between resiliency and commissioning is in the planning, pre-planning phases. Because if we're starting to worry about resilience back here, it might be too late. So what do we do during, during the planning phase of existing building commissioning? Collect all the available data that we have, review everything about that existing facility, get some of the concerns of the client, if they have clients, of why are they bringing us in to do this function. But the keystone here is understanding the current facility requirements. It's amazing sometimes where I'll have a client say, well, Woody, I want you to come into my facility and put it back to the original design intent. And that goes back to the point that I was making earlier, how often do buildings change from that moment of first design, that moment of first construction? Well, usually within days, if not hours, of everybody leaving the job site, they're starting to modify how they're going to do things, especially in controls. My goodness gracious. Owners and facility providers love to play with the BAS, and then sometimes they get in trouble and they say, hey, just reset everything back to 0. And I was like, you're way beyond that. So that's kind of why we need to understand this current facility requirement. Sitting down with the owner, with the occupants, with the O&M staff. It's funny, the person that knows every little thing about how that facility works is usually that person that's got an office full of plants and a space heater under the desk. They know where everybody is hidden in that facility, sometimes to the surprise of the O&M staff. So it's always important when you start talking about these current facility requirements that the owner needs to address. Talk to the occupants, the people that live and work and have to function in. Very critical. But what is a CFR? And why do I keep talking about CFRs? Well, it may be created from the original design, but just don't stick to that. Or the OPR if the building was commissioned at one point. But it's got to reflect the current needs, not past needs, and maybe some projected future use from some owners. I had them, well, Woody, we think we're going to do this, so can you look at those systems and talk about those? I do it with an air of caution, because my pushback is, well, if you think that's going to be a future need, a future requirement, what's your schedule for that? We don't know. Then let's not talk about it. We'll set it off to the side, but we're not going to start changing things on what you might think you're going to do in the future. That's a side note at this point. But the current requirements, what you need now, and how is that building operating compared to what you need now? Now, this is the point that I'm making to connect the dots on energy resiliency. You see the list here of all the functional requirements of that existing building. Now, you can replace the word building with system or campus, especially for military installations, where you've got a lot of facilities working with each other. Obviously, building use, occupancy, schedules, sustainability. But here's something that maybe a lot of you have never seen or talked about. What's the physical and cybersecurity aspect of that? Oh, wow, Woody, we don't do that in functional testing. We worry about, what's consuming power. We got HVAC and lighting, and we might talk a little bit about life safety. But here's my point. If you don't have a generator, as an example, that's inherent to that facility, and you need a generator, and you got to go through 3 layers of physical security to get there, have you tested that in a real-world contingency exercise? Or even if you're relying on one person to get a key into a mechanical room where the switchgear is, as an example, to take power one step further. And that person that has that key is 25 miles away from the facility and can't get there. What do you do? What's that contingency operation? And more importantly, have you tested it for it? Now, we're starting to approach the barriers of what is functional testing, i.e. with commissioning. We're starting to get more into processes and programs and all that, and people will tell me, well, of course we plan for that. Have you tested it? Have you exercised it? Just as much as we exercise, will a central plant come up and down with changing load conditions? Are we looking at the processes to make that facility function in terms of systems maintenance and systems reliability? So that's why you hear in your current facility requirements, I've got physical and cybersecurity, as well as all the other very important things that we need to look for in developing a CFR, and then coming up with recommendations to the owner about how to improve that facility to meet all the CFR requirements. So, I love this chart. I found it in a report called Resiliency Through Energy Efficiency 2014. If you really want to know some good background information on energy resiliency, pull up that report and take a look at it. And I found this pyramid here. In the bottom part is your pre-disaster mitigation. These are the things that you should be doing way before you need it to happen. And one of the interesting things is on the very bottom tier, where you have lots of time and some resources to do, there's not a sense of urgency, is to implement your building codes and training and incentives and financing, figuring out what you need to prepare your facility to withstand attacks. And as you go up the pyramid, increasing time and resources needed to implement post-disaster, provide technical assistance and resources, leverage and expand existing programs, and then coming up with new programs. The more that, from a post-disaster standpoint, this costs lots of money when you have very little time. Example, Puerto Rico. So, in this pyramid, where is it that what I'm talking about makes sense? Well, it's right here in the very bottom. When we start talking about existing building commissioning for campuses or facilities or military installations or laboratories, hospitals, let's, at the very beginning, bring to the table, when we're talking about all the things we want to look at, owner, contingency operation, emergency power, redundant systems. And how are you prioritizing those? So, that leads into the next and final part of this presentation, is talking about what are the expectations that the owner has for the facilities, and how are we prioritizing those? Are we prioritizing our facilities to be either fully mission critical or partially functional or remain dormant? Let's face it, and I'll use a military installation as an example. Every building, of course, is critical to the mission, but they have varying degrees of how important they are. And if you ask any of them, they'll all say, no, we're first. We need to be up all the time. Realistically, though, there needs to be a true analysis of, again, these three categories. Do you stay fully open? The mission relies on you being functional. When you're on a university campus, what facilities there are important or not? And that may be dependent upon relationships that university has with other public entities. What can be partially functional? You know, yes, we have this facility that's served by a central plant, but we can decouple some of these buildings off that central plant. The key is we need to keep that central plant running up to a certain capacity. Or what can remain dormant? You know, we may be down a couple of days, we may be down a week, maybe down a month on an extreme measure. What can really remain dormant? We as commissioning providers can help with that prioritization effort of looking at systems and facilities and then putting in place what are those processes that we can do from a functional standpoint to meet this prioritization. So the goals to meet expectations, the prioritization that I just talked about. Which systems are necessary, which are critical? What are your time frames? What can you do without and for how long? And does your functional testing reflect your disruption of services? We functionally test in optimal situations, and there is nothing wrong with that. That's what we should be doing. What I'm proposing is offer to an owner where this is a very real and legitimate topic of, okay, now, let's test for recovery. Let's test for disaster. And how can we do that? I have received pushback when I've proposed this, and in full disclosure is from an accounting, from a procurement, from a contracting point of view, what is the metric of success on that? And I think that's where you have to really well define in the planning phases, what do we expect this facility to be post-disaster, post-attack, and set that as your success criteria. And does your emergency action and disaster preparedness plans reflect these contingencies that I'm talking about? And does all the facility staff and the occupants and the owners understand what is going to happen to your facility, to your systems, to your campus when disaster hits? So, the testing expectations. Functional test those critical systems. Functional test those systems that the owner flat out says, I need these to be reliable 24/7 under any and all conditions, and test for them. And really see and smoke out, is it realistic with the resources at hand? Do you have primary, secondary, and even tertiary modes of operation? I had breakfast this morning with an individual that brought up that, yeah, we've got all sorts of redundant systems in this facility, but all of them to function, whether it's a primary system or a secondary system, is dependent upon one pump or one piece of equipment. Well, that's your weak link in the chain. If you're not hardening that weakness, I don't care if you have 14 redundant systems. It just doesn't matter. Those are the type of things that we can address through this process of, again, pairing energy resiliency with existing building commissioning. And again, safety is paramount. I put that more as a testing thing because we are talking about situations where we're dealing with equipment that, when the disaster hits, is it safe to operate that equipment? Yes, we want it to bring up as quick as we can, but there comes to a point that life safety trumps everything else. So lessons learned of success. Everyone is a stakeholder. Everybody's responsible, not only in the commissioning process, but in energy resiliency. Knowing all the roles and responsibilities in resiliency as well as the commissioning process is critical. Ambiguity is always the enemy. Communication is always the strengthening aspect of this. Everyone talking to each other. When something is fuzzy, something doesn't make sense, raising the hand and say, I don't understand. Or I don't think you thought about this if we do that. Again, the success of what I'm talking about this morning is contingent upon a conversation happening during the planning phase, before the disaster hits, and making sure that that language is quite clear on how we go forward in trying to improve or bring a facility up to its current requirements. And of course, trying to sustain the mission capability, this is some of my DoD background bleeding through here, is critical. We need that facility for a reason, and we want that facility to continue to function beyond the attack as we're still recovering. And how quickly can we get back to normal operations. And again, safety is always king. So, why existing building commissioning? I think it'll enhance the resilient plan. I think it brings another topic to the conversation for an owner to think about, for facility staff to think about if a disaster should hit. It contributes to the overall facility planning, make it a distinct part of the training for the O&M staff. And I do believe we start talking about this process with energy resilience, it's going to smoke out those things that would keep a facility down and reduce that downtime. And of course, maintaining overall facility readiness. That is my presentation. I really do thank you for your attention, and I will take questions from everyone in the room except Bob. Not yet. I've presented this to owners. Here's the struggle. They're trying to process it also about what all this means. I do have a big financial client that's very interested, and we're walking through okay, step by step, what does this look like? On the federal side, talking to CORE and NAFAC, a lot of it is having a contracting officer understand what's your mode of success here? In their minds, okay, we're already commissioning to an ideal situation. What you're talking about, Woody, sounds like something we really don't need to do. If we're already covering all the bases when everything is fine, then we should already understand these systems well enough to bounce back. So a lot of what I'm presenting here, unfortunately, doesn't have a real world yet, but I'm working on it. Again, I've only presented this. I presented this at 3 different conferences in the last 6 to 8 months, and I'm looking for actually feedback from people in the industry. I get a lot of positive feedback, and that's great. The tripping point is, okay, how? What's next? And that's kind of where I'm at now with this.
What do you do? A lot of work with the military. You referred to that. Do you see them leaning toward this as well?
Well, without being overly critical of DoD. And maybe I should back up here. Who here has dealt with DoD projects? Okay, great. How many lawyers are in the room? Excellent. I can talk for real now. Commissioning seems to be an evolving process with the Corps, with NAFAC. In some districts, they've contracted commissioning out through a third party to work with their district offices. Some districts have said, we're going to do all the commissioning ourselves. And then in some cases, they get in over their head, and then they go back to a third-party consultant to bring aboard. So it's my opinion that DoD is still struggling about what they want with commissioning other than pointing at LEED and saying, do it because LEED says so. Now they're even getting away from that and calling things LEED certifiable instead of certified, and that pendulum is swinging that way. So I see a lot of success of this happening with DoD because mission critical facilities is top of their list. And when I say mission critical here, I'm not talking like server banks. I'm talking about, especially for the Air Force. They fight wars from their facilities and their airfields. So of those facilities on an Air Force base, which are mission critical to fly, fight, and win, as they say. Again, it's education. It's still very early, but I think I will get some traction there once contracting officers understand how do I package this? And what's the metric of success?
Don't be shy.
I'll be up here for a little while after the fact, before our next speaker. If you'd like to come up and talk, berate, I got thick skin. And if there's any questions, comments? I was waiting, Mike. You're just sitting there looking at me.
So I will mention that this is, I appreciate you giving this talk. It's something that I don't think a lot of us think about, especially when you're talking about existing building, what we call retro or recommissioning, but existing building commissioning. The truth is we're doing it, and a lot of us are. We maybe don't think of it this way. For instance, you do a retro, or recommission a data center. You'll do a black start test on the data center. This is what you're doing. I mean, you're testing for resiliency. It's exactly what this is.
Exactly.
We do retro commissioning of hospitals, same concept.
Yep.
So we're doing it. It's interesting. I don't think we've thought about it in this way, in trying to fit into the resiliency. And then you mentioned mission assurance piece. So we talk about, the federal government and DOD. It kind of fits into that mission assurance. It's a great conversation starter for sure when we're talking to them about mission assurance and infrastructure resiliency. So great, thanks, I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate the comment, and I do agree with you that a lot of this here is not brand new. It's services that we are providing it, whether or not we're pointing at it and calling it that, or saying that the results of what we're doing in existing building commissioning contribute to energy resilience. I think it does. I just don't think that we have overtly pointed at a plan and say, this is part of it. Thou shalt do it this way with these focus. So thank you, Mike. I appreciate that comment. Anyone else? Yes, sir.
Other than losing gas, water, electricity, what other items are you looking at resilience on?
I think the biggie, anything dealing with life safety. So we're looking at fire protection systems. We're looking at, as Mike had said, with anything on the data side, anything on the comm side, especially federal government communications is the key there. So I think it just goes beyond, in fact, it brings to light systems that are more important than HVAC under a resilience standpoint, fire protection, life safety, security, comm, which you don't traditionally think as one of the top systems that owners want commissioned. But now you're putting it into the prism of emergency operations. What do you really need? You need power. Power is the key to all of this. And then after that, what's nice to have systems and what are critical systems? And again, life safety, fire protection, et cetera. And for some facilities, your security aspects. Yes, sir.
What subcontractors do you think you're going to be hiring to do these things, like cybersecurity experts, somebody to, pound their system, try to break in?
I'm glad you brought that up because you're now bringing in a group of people that you traditionally wouldn't have had around the table, like cybersecurity, or even some of your physical security aspect folks. All those people that normally sit at the table to talk about disaster preparedness never are in the room when you start talking about commissioning. And, on the surface, that makes sense. But anybody dealing with communications, I think, is going to be critical, and obviously cyber. I've already had a question from Jacobs today, sir. So
here's your second one. While we're talking about a lot of existing buildings, have you had engaged the same conversation in the start of your OPR on new construction, new projects, and what's the feedback you're getting?
That's a natural evolution. I'm at the point right now that it's easier to talk about existing building because the inventory is so much larger, so the opportunities are greater to start coming in with this concept at that point. At the new construction side, I haven't even attempted it yet because, again, this is still, I wouldn't say at the conceptual level, but the conversations are just starting. And I think I'm getting more people's attention on existing than new, because the infrastructure is already in place. They already know what their capabilities are in that facility, and how can we change it to fold into what I'm bringing to the table. But I do see it going that way, just not right now. Right here.
Just a suggestion, you've mentioned comms, but either in new facilities or existing, specifically indicate to the customer to get their IT staff around the table. One of the presentations yesterday, they were talking about, all the IT systems often have UPSs, but when you do a switch from normal power to emergency power, a little bit of phase shift or a voltage drop caused a lot of their UPSs to go absolutely nuts.
Yep. No, that's a very good point, and I should have mentioned IT in this. They're another critical function in this conversation. Thank you. Have a great rest of your conference.